You know, when we think about global conflicts, we tend to put them in their own separate boxes. One over here, one over there. But what if a war in the Middle East could actually pour fuel on the fire of the war in Ukraine? Today, we're going to show you exactly how those dots connect. So here's the big question, the one we're going to unpack today. How on earth could a major conflict involving the US and Iran end up being a good thing for the Kremlin's war efforts? Well, as you're about to see, the connections are way more direct and frankly, more significant than you might think. So let's just lay it all out right at the start. The core idea is this. A long, drawn-out war between the US and Iran wouldn't just be a minor advantage for Russia, it would be a huge strategic victory. It would make Moscow's position much stronger, and it all happens through three powerful ripple effects that we're going to explore one by one. Okay, first up, let's talk about the money. Because, as always, you have to follow the money. This first ripple is all about the price of oil, and it's the economic engine that could really change the entire dynamic of the war in Ukraine. So how does this financial chain reaction actually work? Well, it's pretty simple, really. A big war kicks off in the Middle East, and what happens? The markets get nervous, instability goes up, and global oil prices spike. And since Russia is a huge energy exporter, its state revenues suddenly surge. And you can bet where that extra cash goes, straight into funding its war in Ukraine. And this isn't just speculation. I mean, listen to this quote from France 24. A surge in oil revenue could, and I quote, boost Moscow's revenues just as sanctions had begun to weaken Russia's campaign. It's basically a direct economic lifeline, arriving at the exact moment they need it most. Okay, so that's the money, but what about the actual weapons? That brings us to our second ripple, the military axis. This goes way beyond economics and gets right down to the nuts and bolts of what's happening on the battlefield. You see, the partnership between Moscow and Tehran isn't just a handshake and a photo op. We're talking about a very real, very tangible supply chain. Russia's ability to keep up its attacks in Ukraine is becoming more and more dependent on getting a steady flow of weapons and parts from Iran. And when we say military hardware, we're not talking about abstract ideas. We're talking about specific, lethal equipment. Iran has been sending Russia its Shahed attack drones, critical parts like engines, tons of artillery ammunition, and there's even the potential for them to send even more destructive ballistic missiles. And just to hammer this point home, United 24 Media puts it pretty bluntly. Russia's war effort, quote, partly depends on the Moscow-Tehran axis. So you can imagine any conflict that pushes Iran and Russia even closer together is likely going to speed up and expand this critical flow of weapons. All right, so we've got money and we've got weapons. The third and final ripple is something a little less tangible, but maybe even more important. It's the great distraction. This is all about the simple fact that global attention is a finite resource. Think about it. A huge new war in the Middle East would basically become a black hole for Western resources. U.S. military assets would have to be moved around, the top diplomats would shift their focus, the global media would be all over the new conflict, and the political bandwidth in Washington, it would be completely consumed by the new crisis. As the Telegraph points out, this would put Ukraine's leadership in an incredibly tough spot. They would suddenly have to struggle just to keep their fight for survival on the global agenda. And when the world's attention shifts away, well, so does the political and military support that Ukraine desperately needs. Okay, so we've laid out three pretty big ways a conflict could actually help Russia. But hold on, is it really that simple? Is this a guaranteed win for Moscow? Let's step back and do the final math here. Because you have to ask, right? Could this whole thing actually backfire and end up weakening Russia? Well, it turns out it could. It all comes down to one single crucial factor. And that factor is time. The entire outcome for Russia really hinges on how long the conflict lasts, because a short, quick war has a completely different effect than a long, drawn-out one. So let's just break down these two futures. In a brief conflict, maybe U.S. strikes disrupt Iran's ability to ship drones to Russia. The oil price spike is just a blip, and the West doesn't really get distracted for long. The outcome? Russia's actually weakened. But in a prolonged war, the opposite happens. The Iran-Russia military cooperation gets even deeper, high oil prices become the new normal, and Western attention gets split for the long haul. The outcome there? Russia gets significantly stronger. So, which one of these is more likely? Well, according to most military analysts, a quick, clean victory against Iran just isn't really in the cards. You've got its tough mountainous geography, a very large population, and a military that relies on asymmetric tactics, using things like drones and missiles to counter a more powerful enemy. All of that means any conflict would likely become a very long, very costly affair. And that makes the scenario that benefits Russia the more probable one. And all of this really brings us to the big takeaway, doesn't it? As we see the ripples from one crisis wash up on the shores of another, it poses a pretty sobering question. In today's interconnected world, is any major conflict ever truly fought in isolation? Thanks for joining us.